Good morning, everyone. I'm Murray Hunt. I'm the director of the Bingham Centre of the Rule of Law. And it's my pleasure to welcome all those of you who are in the room here this morning and all those of you who are joining us online to our very important speech this morning by the Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, the Right Honourable David Lammy MP, on the importance of the international rule of law. David is a very well-known and experienced politician, and he really needs very little introduction from me. As you'll all know, he's been the Labour MP for Tottenham since 2000. He was a junior minister in a number of roles in both the Blair and the Brown governments before 2010. He was Shadow Secretary of State for Justice and Shadow Lord Chancellor from 2020 to 2021, and he's been Shadow Foreign Secretary since November 2021. David, as you also all know, is a lawyer, although he has very modestly made sure this morning that I'm going to point out to you all that he's here in his capacity as a politician, not as a lawyer. So if there are any particularly difficult questions from lawyers, he says he will listen with interest and learn. What many of you may not know, however, is that David was actually the first Black Briton to attend Harvard Law School. Just a few years after I had the privilege of being a classmate with another future aspiring politician, one Barack Obama, who I had the good fortune to be a classmate of in Larry Tribe's constitutional law course, which is a course, David, you may well have taken yourself. Like the future US president, David has a very distinguished record of public service in the service of a very important rule of law principle, equality before the law, not least in his leadership of the independent review into the treatment and outcomes for people from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds in the criminal justice system, an incredibly important report in 2017. Which was commissioned by the then Prime Minister David Cameron and was received by his successor as Prime Minister, Theresa May. And I think David's work in his capacity leading that review demonstrates that he is an extremely unusual politician, because he does have the ability to reach out across party lines and build cross-party political consensus about what it means in practice for us to be committed to certain fundamental things like principles of equal treatment. And that does make him, in my experience, quite unusual as an elected politician, and is the mark really of a true, if I may say so, constitutionalist. And that brings us to the subject matter of this morning's speech. David, in your speech at Chatham House earlier this year, you tantalizingly, about Labour's foreign policy, you tantalizingly referred to putting the rule of law at the heart of the Labour government's approach to foreign policy, if there were to be a Labour government. And we were all very interested in that comment. And we're not surprised, of course, because of your own commitment to that principle, and indeed the commitment of the leader of your party, Keir Starmer, who you all know also is a lawyer and committed to the rule of law. And let's not forget, in his maiden speech to Parliament in 2015, he referred to Tom Bingham and the rule of law as having been an inspiration to him, both in his legal career and he hoped it would be in his political career. So we're delighted, David, that you've chosen as the place in which to elaborate on that tantalizing line in your Chatham House speech, the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, which, as many of you will know, is an independent, non-partisan organisation which is very proud to work with politicians of all parties who are committed to Tom Bingham's rich conception of the rule of law. Before I hand over to you, David, a little bit of housekeeping from me. We're not planning any fire drills, so please respect the fire alarm and proceed out back the way you came, down to Russell Square if there is a fire alarm. David's going to speak for about 20-25 minutes, following which I will ask him a few quick questions from the comfort of the armchair, before we then open up to questions and answers, questions from you here in the room. So do please be ready to ask David any questions you have when he finishes speaking. David, a very, very warm welcome to the Bingham Centre, and I hand over to you.
Well, look, thank you very much indeed. Very, very good to be here. And can I just I'm reminded as I was coming into Russell Square this morning that it's 33 years ago that I first arrived, actually it's probably 34 years ago, as a young student in a very shiny, cheap suit to be interviewed at the School of Oriental and African Studies to study law, and then a bit further down the road at King's. I got into both places, but decided to come to SOAS. So the Russell Square area is where my own legal journey begun, and it's just wonderful so many years later to be here this morning. The rule of law is a simple but revolutionary idea founded on two principles. First, that there should be no power beyond or above the law. And second, the law applies equally to all people, woman or man, rich or poor, black or white, working person or conservative prime minister. For centuries, the United Kingdom helped to forge the idea of the rule of law, constraining political power, protecting civil liberties, and articulating fundamental rights. From the Magna Carta in 1215 to the Charter of the Forest in 1217, the Petition of Right in 1628, the Bill of Rights in 1689, right up to the Human Rights Act in 1998. Not only is our system of common law spread around large swathes of the world, but this country has been at the very forefront of the development of international law. It's a proud history, born of the horrors, of course, of the Second World War. This country recognized that domestic law alone was insufficient to guard against the threats of our time, and that global security was best pursued through an international rules-based order. British lawyers helped set up the Nuremberg trials, where those responsible for history's worst crimes were held to account. We were key to the establishment of the crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and the development of international humanitarian law led, of course, to the Geneva Conventions of 1949. And Winston Churchill and Clement Attlee played a fundamental role in creating the United Nations, with respect for international law at the heart of the UN Charter. The European Convention on Human Rights was in large part drafted by British lawyers. We played a vital role in the creation of the International Criminal Court and human rights conventions, but not least the Convention Against Torture. Today, it's easy to take the rule of law for granted, but in many parts of the world, it remains a foreign concept. Just ask Vladimir Kara-Murza, the British-Russian journalist and political activist, poisoned and imprisoned by the Russian state for his point of view. Or ask the young women of Afghanistan, denied education rights and basic rights under the totalitarian rule of the Taliban. The rule of law was only won in this country as a result of human persistence, struggle, and tremendous sacrifice. For years, it was not applied equally to all people. It took the great pioneers of the 20th century, people who started the century without equal rights, women, ethnic minorities, LGBTQ+ communities, and working people, organizing, campaigning, and protesting until they acquired them. And this is not a partisan point. As those rights were won, political consensus was forged. The rule of law is not a Labour or Conservative value. It is our common inheritance. No party owns it, no government should squander it. From Edward Burke to Margaret Thatcher, the rule of law lay at the heart of the conservative vision of society. As Thatcher, a leader don't usually quote, once said, being democratic is not enough. A majority cannot turn what is wrong into right. In order to be considered truly free, countries must also have a deep love of liberty and an abiding respect for the rule of law. So bipartisan was the British devotion to this idea that we became the global home of the law. Businesses from around the world flocked to Britain to write contracts in English law and settle disputes in our courts. They did this because they trusted us. At the heart of that trust was a simple principle. Whichever party was in government, the rule of law would be respected. It brings shame to our nation that this generation of conservatives have cast doubt upon the principle and besmirched our international reputation. That brings me to international law today. Lord Bingham noted the rule of law requires compliance by the state with its obligations in international law, just as in national law, and Labour agrees. But today I want to address the bitter international law paradox created by this current Tory government. We live in a time in which the magnitude of the global challenges we face have never been greater, and the need for compliance with international law more vital. But inexplicably, in the face of these challenges, this government's attitude to international law has never been more cavalier. It should be obvious to all that we face not only traditional international threats that require international law to be upheld, but enormous global challenges that require international law to be developed on the challenges of our future, like climate change and artificial intelligence. But at this critical time in global history, the United Kingdom government is not simply absent without leave, but consistently taking steps to undermine international law. It was a shameful moment in the modern history of this country when the government announced almost with pride that the international markets legislation would break international law in a specific and limited way, as if it was some form of acceptable mitigation. At a stroke, the government undermined the countless years in which we sought to occupy a leadership role in international law. At a stroke, the government signaled to the world, including those contemplating entering trade agreements with us, that we might sign an agreement one day, only to disavow our legal obligations under it if it was later politically inconvenient. The pattern has been repeated in the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, the Nationality and Borders Bill, the Illegal Immigration Bill, and last week in the Economic Activity of Public Bodies Bill. And it was only concerted campaigning from Labour that ensured that the Overseas Operations Act passed without original clauses that breached the Geneva Convention. For years, the government ignored the opinions of the ICJ, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, and the UN General Assembly about the Chagos Islands. Only belatedly, the government sought what we have long called for, a new settlement that brings the UK into compliance with international law, redresses the historical injustice done to the Chagosians, maintains the marine protected environment around the islands, and meets strategic security concerns. All of this at the same time as threatening to repeal the Human Rights Act and the European Convention on Human Rights. This would be a total abdication of our international law responsibilities, putting us in the company of Russia and Belarus as the only European countries outside of it, and sending precisely the wrong message to those countries in which the rule of law is proving so very fragile. None of this will do. International law is often the quiet miracle supporting modern economic and political life. It underpins the millions of tons of cargo that cross the globe every day, and the thousands of planes that crisscross the airspace of countries safely. It articulates universal rights, it sets universal standards, it enables diplomacy, and it prevents conflict. It settles disputes peacefully, from international fishing rights to even financial fair play in football. It contributes to prosperity and security for our country every single day. We consistently proclaim the importance of complying with international law to other nations. We stress, for example, the solemn obligation to comply with treaties such as the Convention Against Torture and to demand support for the International Criminal Court. We tell Iran to comply with the JCPOA. We tell China to comply with the Sino-British Joint Declaration in Hong Kong, and we are right to do so. Agreements must be kept, yet our ability to protect and promote international law has been fundamentally undermined by the dangerous attitude of the present government. It has weakened our foreign policy while strengthening that of our rivals. It has provided ammunition to countries such as Russia and China, who use allegations of hypocrisy as a tool in the United Nations. International law is just vital to human rights. It's essential for international trade, for giving our British companies the security they need to trade overseas, for reassuring foreign companies that they can do business here, safe in the knowledge that their legal rights will be respected and upheld. International law provides the framework for international commerce to flourish, essential as we seek to rebuild the British economy after so many years of neglect. And of course, our international reputation for upholding the rule of law has hardly been helped by the flagrant domestic law breaking at the heart of this government. And I don't just mean the attacks on lawyers and judges, pitting courts against the people rather than treating them as the protectors of the people. I don't just mean threats to restrict judicial review, but actual law breaking. In office, Boris Johnson made history by becoming the first Prime Minister found to have broken the law. Then he lied about it. And let's not forget the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, broke the very same laws. So how will the next Labour government be different? A central principle that must and will underpin the next Labour government's foreign policy is an unwavering respect for the rule of law, both in domestic law and international law, because it's the right thing to do, because it's in our interests in a newly dangerous and divided world, and frankly, because it is fundamental to this shadow cabinet's DNA. I first heard the name Keir Starmer from mutual friends when, as a young law student, I spent time in the Caribbean working to end the death penalty. Keir dedicated much of his young life to this noble pursuit. He was a hugely respected defender of people's rights before becoming Britain's top prosecutor, holding those who break the law to account, defending victims, fighting terrorism, and standing up for justice. It's why, with his leadership, Labour has pushed the government to go further on holding Vladimir Putin to account for his crimes in Ukraine, pushing for a special tribunal to prosecute Putin and his cronies since March last year. When I moved from law to politics, a little earlier than Keir, I was too. A lawyer first, a politician second. My life changed when I was given the chance to become the first Black Briton to study at Harvard Law School. Today, I'm proud to be a member of the same chambers as Keir. We both followed the law first because of a fundamental belief in the rule of law, a belief that will be central to how the next Labour government will govern at home and abroad. And today I will set out how we will put the rule of law at the centre of our foreign policy, addressing the challenges of tomorrow as well as today. First, we will repair Britain's legal reputation and influence. We will update the ministerial code. reinstating the duty of ministers to comply with international law and the treaty obligations that Britain has signed up to. David Cameron's decision to remove it in 2015 showed contempt, and it foreshadowed the reckless abandonment of this principle by his successors. With Keir Starmer in number 10, the rules will be clear. Ministers will be bound to comply with international law, and we will commit to staying a part of the European Convention on Human Rights, stopping it being used as a political football by the Conservative right. And as Yvette Cooper, Labour's next Home Secretary, has said, we will end the gimmick of the unworkable Rwanda scheme, using the money saved to set up a new cross-border police unit to crack down on smuggling gangs. Second, we will stand up for human rights and challenge impunity. Too many international crimes go unpunished. Too many dictators never face justice. We welcome the recent action by Canada and the Netherlands to bring a torture case against Bashar Assad to the ICJ for his crimes against the people of Syria, and urge the UK government to support it. And we wholeheartedly support efforts to document Putin's crimes in Ukraine so that he can one day face justice. At the UN, we will partner with like-minded countries to build a coalition who support the suspension of the veto in cases of mass atrocities. And we will work to strengthen protections for humanitarian access and document and hold to account those responsible for the denial of aid. And we will use trade policy to support human rights, helping to tackle abuses like forced labour and modern slavery. A Labour government will consistently challenge clear breaches of international law. Third, we will put the UK at the forefront of international legal debates. And we will lead on the challenges of the future, establishing the new rules of the road for the frontiers that will shape the next century. On climate, the greatest challenges we face, alongside making the investments necessary to deliver the net zero transition, we will take a leading role in proposing new international legal frameworks, pushing for climate action to become a fourth pillar of the United Nations, and working with international partners in the ICC to agree a new international law of ecocide. Because the climate crisis can only be solved at a global level. And today, as the International Seabed Authority meets to discuss deep sea mining, Labour will join France, Germany, Switzerland, New Zealand, Spain, Chile, Ecuador, Vanuatu, and Costa Rica, as well as businesses including BMW, Renault, Google, Samsung, and Philips in taking action, by calling for a precautionary pause on this practice until and unless there is clear scientific evidence it can be done safely and that the marine environment can be effectively protected by new regulation. Artificial intelligence offers incredible opportunities for growth, but this potential will be derailed if governments fail to act together to prevent the highest risks that it poses. Alongside domestic regulation, we should be leading global diplomatic efforts to stop AI from being exploited by terrorists, criminals, and autocrats, hoping to use it to suppress freedom, disseminate misinformation, and undermine democratic processes. We should work with the widest possible coalition of countries on AI development and governance, including in areas that impact on the technology of nuclear weapons. It is in Britain's interest that this includes China, because it makes no sense to exclude one of the largest markets of artificial intelligence from these rules. And fourth, we will use the rule of law to position the UK as a leader on economic statecraft. Dirty money from Russia and other authoritarian states like Iran has been infiltrating London for more than a decade. Money laundering has seen London homes become the bitcoins of kleptocrats, pricing out our frontline workers from their own homes, leading to corruption, bribery, and even the financing of terrorists. Labour has a plan to tackle kleptocracy on the international stage. We back calls for a new transatlantic anti-corruption council to be established to coordinate the fight against corruption. And in Labour's first year in office, we will invite foreign ministers from Five Eyes, the European Union, and the United States to London to develop a common strategy to coordinate the fight against kleptocracy. And today I can announce that Labour will join calls for the establishment of an international anti-corruption court designed to prosecute the most egregious acts of corruption, the kleptocrats, the most corrupt business people, and those who enable them. Labour is determined to clean up the London laundromat at home and defeat kleptocracy around the world. Labour's vision for foreign policy is to reconnect Britain for our security and prosperity at home. We believe in Britain, but we're frustrated by the Conservatives' manufactured decline in our influence. We can restore Britain's standing and realise our potential by using the international rule of law as the connective tissue which binds us to other nations, creating consensus around the laws that will shape the world's future, protecting our world's precarious climate and environment, shaping the rules on new technologies in our own interests, and ending the age of impunity that allows authoritarians to hide their stolen cash in our capital. This future fills me with hope. It will allow Britain to flourish once again, keeping our scientists at the cutting edge of future technologies, ensuring our country remains a global centre for service sectors and the law, and maintaining the respect for our cultural industries to shape the global conversation. I end with the words of the preamble to the Charter of the United Nations. We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and nations large and small, and to establish conditions which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. When the next Labour government makes foreign policy, all of our choices will be underpinned by a fundamental belief in the rule of law. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much indeed. You've really, I think, begun the really important process of putting some flesh on the bones there of the tantalizing line in the Chatham House speech. And I think it's very important at this stage in the political cycle to start to do that. It's very easy to say that we'll put the rule of law at the heart of UK foreign policy, but what that actually means in practice, in practical policy terms, is a much harder question to answer. And I think you've really begun to sketch out some really interesting ideas in what you've said this morning. So thank you very much indeed, David. Before we open it up to questions from the floor, I'd just like to pick up on a few quick things in what you've said, David, if I may, to get the conversation going. So I want to start with one of the eye-catching commitments in what you've said, which is that a Labour government would support the creation of a new international anti-corruption court. Now, some might say that in the current era, that's quite a brave commitment, given the number of states worldwide that are pushing back against international courts, depicting them as foreign bodies that are intruding into national sovereignty. I'm just interested in what sort of UK leadership would be required in order to build the political consensus, get the political momentum going in that sort of political context, where there are a lot of populist states who are opposed in principle to the role of international courts.
Well, my starting point is what would Labour government have done were it done of Russia's aggression and war. And I'm quite sure that it would have, I know, because of the way I attempted to hold alongside Rachel Williams and Jonathan Reynolds, all of this, and my bench, like this Brian in Margaret, attempted to hold the government in this business of democracy and no more standing in our country. And I think we would have doubled down in that area and sought that moment to increase the appetite globally on the issue of corruption. Sadly, we're not enough, so the moment was missed. But it is an issue that we will return to. And it's similar to the way that the Biden government, when coming into office, really took up the issue of misinformation and disinformation and trying to widen the debate about support for democracy and the challenge that was being coming from which publications and some of the issues in our social media. So I think there is an opportunity. I don't say it happens over all the time, but it's important for a country like ours with a seat policy and events occur and pressure builds on other countries to join. I committed Labour to push for the co-sign. When I was actually Shadow Minister of Justice a couple of years ago, at the time, Philip Sands has just done work on the co-sign. I think France specifically that they were key, and there were lots of small island nations very particularly threats and destroying our rainforests to their survival. I'm delighted to see the momentum over 2 years. So momentum can come, but it does require countries like ours to do it.
And do you think there's been, you mentioned the special tribunal in relation to crime of aggression and impunity generally. And I'm just wondering whether you think there's been at least the beginnings of some sort of a sea change in relation to recognizing the importance of international courts and tribunals since the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
I think there has. I think I think the work of the International Criminal Court is very, very important, and would want to strengthen and support it, particularly in terms of resource, which is the issue I've spoken to them about. Notwithstanding that, I think that the crimes of aggression are very important. I think that there's been a recognition that it, in a sense, if we can get there, targets Putin specific. And I think we have got to overcome this business of not being a signatory, meaning Ukraine or Russia, to the ICC, and also Russia's position on the Security Council. I think that's gathered momentum. I spoke to a number of allies and partners at the Recovery Conference a couple of weeks ago when they were here, and I think that's why very much actually with Keir's leadership on this issue, he took a big interest in this issue. We've taken the position with him.
I'd like to ask you about a particular international court, the European Court of Human Rights, which we're very used to discussing in this country. It's very seldom out of the news in the last few years in the UK. You mentioned in your speech what would be a very welcome commitment to the ECHR and to remove any uncertainty about whether the UK wishes to remain the signatory to the ECHR. Now, of course, in the recent Reykjavik Declaration, Prime Minister Sunak did reaffirm the UK's commitment, deep and abiding commitment to the European Convention and to the European Court of Human Rights. But at the same time, the government is bringing forward a provision in the illegal migration bill, which is currently before the House of Lords, which would give ministers the power to ignore interim measures from the Strasbourg Court. So at the same time as making that commitment in the Reykjavik Declaration, we have a provision in domestic legislation where the government is asking Parliament to give ministers that power, which doesn't really seem very consistent with that deep and abiding commitment. So I'd just like to ask whether would a Labour government signal that the end to that undermining of the court's authority by considering repealing that sort of provision in relation to interim measures in the illegal migration bill if it were to become law?
Look, I am very worried about a populist tone that can be found on the fringe right and in fact the fringe left globally, that allows for what I would describe as democratic backsliding. And I think that the language around interim measures, which we've always signed up to, should not be reneged on. And I think after the reputational damage that I indicated in my speech, the next government has to be absolutely rock solid on its commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights. Absolutely rock solid. I would like to think that that is not purely a Labour tradition. I think that there are Conservatives like my friend David Gork, Henry Clark, Michael Heseltine, that would sign up to that tradition. So I hope that that party too will reflect and get back to that position. But in the meantime, I think that that does really mean interim measures as well. I'm really clear about that.
Final area I'd just like to explore, David, with you is I'm very interested in you identified there are lots of great global challenges out there, which require global collaboration in order to have any prospect of overcoming. You mentioned climate change, you mentioned AI and modern slavery and trafficking. And you call really for a reinvigoration of multilateralism and for the UK to take a leadership role in that reinvigoration. One of the things the Bingham Centre is working on at the moment through its Modern Slavery and Human Rights Policy and Evidence Centre is trying to establish a global commission on modern slavery and human trafficking, working closely with Theresa May, and very much modelled on Gordon Brown's Global Commission on Education. I'm just interested on the basis that that's the sort of global challenge of which you're talking, that really requires political leadership at an international level. It requires multilateral efforts, and it requires leaders to come together to make sure that there's political action taken on those sorts of things internationally. I'm just interested in whether you think, in the context of your lecture, The Rule of Law, whether there's space for a global commission on the rule of law, whether that might be something which could take forward your ideas about the need for intellectual leadership, the need to develop international law, to build consensus about the meaning of the rule of law internationally, the importance of the rule of law internationally, and what sort of action is necessary in order to make sure the rule of law is the basis going forward.
Well, let me just cast the response a little wider than that and then drill down a bit. It turns out that around about 2005 was the high point in the emergence of liberal democracies as a way to govern. And there are now less and less democracies. And as my friend David Miliband articulates very well, we're living in an age of impunity, very sadly. That's the sort of low depressive point. I think that more optimistic is that when you look at the votes in the United Nations on Ukraine and the countries that are prepared to say, no, actually, what we're seeing with this Russian aggression is unacceptable, and supporting the sovereignty of Ukraine, there is a much bigger coalition of countries that are prepared to get behind the rule of law as a way to order society than perhaps the traditional notion of liberal democracy, if you like, the West. And so I think that there is more work to do, perversely in this age, on the rule of law. There are more partners who are not liberal democracies that will sign up to order in terms of the rule of law. I can think of states in the Gulf, for example, that do support the rule of law, but aren't terribly keen on liberal democratic ideas. I was in Singapore for the Shangri-La Dialogue a few weeks ago, and similarly in that region of the world, growing region, there would be countries that would fall into that box. So I think the idea is an interesting one, and I'll look at it more closely.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed, David. We're now going to throw it open to you, the audience. We'll take 2 questions at a time. And if when you ask your question, if you could just very briefly identify yourself before you ask your question, please. So do you have any questions from the audience?
Can I just say, in such a distinguished room, questions or observations?
And
Good morning, Lawrence Daring from Allen Overy. David, great to have you here today. I wanted to pick up on the ecocide idea, and I wanted to ask you, of course, we're all familiar, there are a lot of international instruments out there dealing with the environment. What would be the benefit of another international convention, as opposed to making those we already have work better and actually enforceable?
David, would you prefer to answer each question as it comes?
Yeah.
And
thanks very much, Mr. Lammy, for your remarks. Anthony Smith, Westminster Foundation for Democracy. I just wanted to pick up a little bit on the comments you made in the Q&A on liberal democracy, etc. I think it is possible to get tied up in language which can be alienating or not attractive to some people. I think we would see democracy, democratic governance, and rule of law as inseparably connected, because you need some political accountability to help manage and encourage legal accountability. And I think we'd also see democratic governance, things which reduce the risk of impunity, that try and prevent the abuse of power, as fundamental to achieving the whole range of priorities which you've set out in your Fabian pamphlet, as well as today, about the rule of law. I think the question I have is about whether or not you would agree that it would be a natural and important thing for the UK to do, to invest a bit more strategically and systematically in supporting countries and populations who are trying to deepen their democracy, because that helps to encourage an international community which is respectful of the rule of law. Whether or not the governments say like to use the word democracy or not, that fact of the democratic culture in countries actually limiting the abuse of power and supporting accountability. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Look, the point that's made about reinforcing and supporting the international laws that we currently have at a time particularly of liberal democracies remain on those lines, never mind other countries that haven't signed up to them, and a UN Security Council, I think particularly, that struggles because of veto, I think is a point well made. Nevertheless, and when I sort of was walking here, I realized that in the current environment, there might be an interruption to this speech from Just Stop Oil. Turns out there's no orange confetti. But in this age of such acute climate emergency, my own view is that the case for ecocide is made. And there's a sort of solidarity exercise, because when you sit, as I did last week with the Foreign Minister of Vanuatu, you realize that for them, just a few degrees is the disappearance of their island. My parents stem from the country of Guyana. Guyana has traditionally been the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, but it has protected its rainforests there in the Amazon basin. However, there's just been the world's biggest discovery of oil. So this is a very, very important period for the countries of Guyana. Development might well lead to pressure to cut down its rainforests. And what happened next door in Venezuela and in Brazil under the last administration is really very, very alarming. So I do think that there is a coalition of interests around either side. Of course, when you champion this, it also allows progressive forces in countries to think about how this might work in domestic legislation before you even get to international legislation, and that's important. Also, I think to corporate interests that can sometimes be rather slapdash about these issues. So I think the case is made. Your points around democracy are good points, and just to be cross-party for a moment, I do think the government's recent work on championing a free press internationally is good work. I'm not sure it's had quite the resource and the welling behind it that it might have had we been in power, but the initiative is a good initiative that I would seek to build on, not dismantle. And it goes to the heart of our democratic tradition. Notwithstanding that, we do have to sort of face up to a sort of real politique in the geopolitical moment. And there is, I think, when I speak to leaders in what has been, it's not a great phrase, describes the global south, some bad feeling. I think there's bad feeling towards the developed West in relation to how we dealt with the rollout of the pandemic vaccine, where there was a perception of selfishness and a lack of generosity in relation to issues around intellectual property, particularly. And I think it's gone down tremendously bad that a country that had taken such a leadership position on international development has not just cut its aid budget from 0.7 to 0.5, but it's then spending a significant proportion of the 0.5 domestic. And so I think that this is an era where the coalition, perhaps, or the stressing on the coalition, ought perhaps to be around democracy, yes, rule of law, sure, liberal, I think is under some pressure.
Thank you, David. We have some more questions. If we could take one here at this side of the aisle, and then the other side of the aisle, make these for the microphone.
Thank you. My name is Fiona Darroch, and I work in an organisation called Protomos, for whom Linda Dobbs joins us on our advisory board. And so it's a privilege to hear what you have to say, because I know how highly she speaks of everything in the way of your thoughts and your reports and so forth. Our organisation has kindly had the support of the Bingham Centre in the work that we do with Supreme Court judges in Africa. We've got a growing group, one Supreme Court judge per country, and they convene remotely and then in an annual meeting. And it's a very interesting place where you can take the temperature of exactly how we are perceived on the international stage. And I can only say that my cheeks go red and redder each year with embarrassment for all the reasons that you gave at the very beginning of your speech. And my first point, because you allowed us to make comments, is that there is a closing window of opportunity at this point in the UK's history. Our credibility as defenders of the rule of law, and indeed, as you set out, that window of opportunity is closing. And if we carry on without putting a really smart brake and changing gear, then it will be gone in the normal way of a decline after the end of empire. Sorry to be historic about it. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we run a program of community legal empowerment, in which we work at the base of the pyramid with communities where there have been assaults upon resource rights, land rights, water rights, you name it. And the idea is that we work with local lawyers to build local hubs where local law can be used. And gradually, the interest in our work is growing at one level, and we're turning into pariahs at another level, because we constitute threats, particularly by using international law. And what I would like to know is, in the spectrum of things, what would be the first 2 or 3 steps that a Labour government would take to try and correct, first of all, the perception, and then the practical business of allowing people to have access in an equal way to the legal system in their own countries? Thank you.
Come across the aisle.
Thank you. James Palmer from Herbert Smith Freehills, and I also chair the City UK's Legal Services Group, representing the sector from a sort of broader commercial perspective with government. Thank you for your comments, David, and the very strong, very welcome, I'm sure, commitment to rule of law and abiding by UK obligations, certainly on our part. Can I ask you about, to expand maybe a bit on what I think is one of the most difficult issues, which you've alluded to, which is the realpolitik bit. When we have events such as have happened in Ukraine, and we're talking about response to Russia, in some ways it's quite easy to build coalitions on that. I mean, you're right about the breadth of response and its encouragement. But the more difficult bit, it seems to me, which ties in with your focus on trust, which I also deeply support, is the tensions around those who we have good relationships with, but who do not run their countries on models and systems, the liberal democracy principle that was alluded to, and how you see the UK dealing with that, because we don't live in a world that is entirely dominated by liberal democracies, and that tension seems to me to give rise to some of the scope for populist mistrust and the accusations of hypocrisy and so on. And I know it's not easy, but I'd be interested to hear any further comments on it. Thank you.
Well, in fact, both questions are connected, and I'm very grateful to them. Thank you so much for the mention of Linda Dobbs. Linda Dobbs is a great mentor of mine. 30 odd years ago, when I was, just thinking about law, Linda Dobbs was the first Black lawyer I ever saw in court. It was incredible. She had sort of forensic kind of ability. So thank you for that mention. And one of the saddest, toughest moments I've had in the last couple of years, since Keir asked me to take up this role, was actually visiting Afghanistan. I wanted to get to Afghanistan because I was just so horrified that it had totally dropped out of the news cycle, notwithstanding the betrayal people there felt in relation to our advocacy, if you like, of the rule of law, democratic values. And it's been very depressing to meet with particularly the female judges in that country. They did so much, and they're, the sort of betrayal they feel, the heartbreak they feel at what's happening. I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan with tears rolling down my eyes, because it's very, very hard to meet with young women in the country. And, it's hard to point to where the hope is. It's like Handmaid's Tale. It's quite unbelievable. And that sort of connects really to what you were saying in relation to the judiciary, its importance, in the global south and in Africa, particularly where you spent time. Listening to you makes me think. I'm not gonna add another policy proposal to my speech, but it does on the hoof. Partly because my three advisors are sitting in front of me, and I'm starting to be giving me looks. I think that there might be scope in terms of strengthening the UK's reputation, and if you take my speech as a floor, not a ceiling, on convening some kind of, we've got such wonderful eminent lawyers, men of whom are in this room, some sort of advisory council in those early months in office, just to help us accelerate our reputation quickly. So if I can take that away, and also that expertise of what I'm really keen, by the way, to say that I do think this is on the sort of broader development piece. I am sometimes conscious how if you get the tone wrong, you can sound a bit hectoring in the global south. You know, this is a post-colonial age, and one's got to be sensitive to these issues. So it is about gathering alongside the judiciary in those countries, lawyers in those countries, civil society in those countries, and hearing how they would fit it, what they would value, not simply sitting here in London and coming up to those judgments myself. So I hesitate to say the what, but the how we do it, I think is very, very important indeed. I think the point that you make around liberal democracy is the center of the debate and the discussion. I sort of want to build out from democracy itself and from the rule of law, but be a bit gentle on recognizing that there are other traditions globally that over the course of this next period, we are living with two global superpowers. There is these populist elements coming back in an age of more limited resource. And there are some challenges, and AI might be one of them, for example, that also puts greater pressure in some ways as some jobs are lost in working class communities in northern democracies. But just an example to your point, notwithstanding the debate that's gone on about Brexit in this country since the referendum and the decision to leave the European Union, I've been impressed when I've been in Brussels, when I've been in European Union settings with ministers and others in discussion, at the way the European Union has handled countries that are not quite in that liberal democratic tradition. Hungary is an example at this moment in time. And so I do think that broadly in Europe, which is why I've been keen to say that, look, we might be out of the European Union, but in terms of history, shared values, our most important trading partners, you know, we are absolutely umbilically tied to our European cousins. That tradition that you're underpinning is very, very strong here. And there's much that we can do together, it seems to me, because we're in a region of the world where you can see so many countries that share those values. Yes, populist tendencies are coming in. I'm minded of France next door. Let's see what happens after their next election. But nevertheless, a common history that I think is going to be very, very important over this next period.
David, can we detain you for a little bit longer, because there are a few more questions from the floor that I know we'd like to get to. And there are two here, and then two here, and one at the back. So we're
Fine.
across the level.
Let's take 3 and then 2 more.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Hi, Emily Channon. I'm setting up the Global Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking that Murray mentioned. Thanks so much for coming in today. It's great to hear you speak. I have 2 very small questions, so hopefully you'll permit me to. The first is, you mentioned how the rule of law has been broken by various governments, and I'm actually on secondment from the civil service, so I wondered what your advice is for civil servants working within the context of governments breaking the rule of law. And then my second smaller question is, would you reverse the decision taken by the Conservatives to merge the Foreign Office and DFID?
Okay, 2 over here next to each other.
Hello. Just wanted to say thank you very much, David, for your speech, and to the Bingham Center for organizing. My name is June and I work at Liberty. I just wanted to pick up on, I guess, part of your introduction, given that some of the legislation that you discussed that violates the UK's international obligations, like the Illegal Migration Bill and the Economic Activity of Public Bodies Bill, are still ongoing. I'd be interested in what Labour's approach, I guess, politically and rhetorically will be, and also whether it will make commitments in the first 100 days as to how it will deal with these pieces of legislation, which will obviously continue to apply to any future government, including a Labour government. And the second question, if you'll permit me as well, is that a few years ago, I think yourself and our director at the time, Gracie Bradley, had a similar event at the IPPR. At the time you were Shadow Justice Secretary, and at the time you spoke about incorporation of further human rights treaties, including UNCRC, and in other instances, the Labour Party has also committed to incorporating the UNCRPD. So I just wondered whether these also featured as part of the commitment that you've made to Labour being at the forefront of addressing both future but also existing challenges. Thanks.
David, they've each asked 2 questions. I think there are 3 more questions. So if we take those 4 questions from those 2, and then we'll have the last 3 questions.
I'm not going to give civil service advice. I hesitate to do that. I think that the important known principles, the importance of civil servants' independence is really key. I could have done another speech. My wonderful mentor and colleague, Charlie Fulton, was very articulate about the terrible backsliding pressure that's been brought to bear on civil service this time. But I think that I hope that when and if we come to office, it's a bit like sort of, you know, honey on toast for our civil service. The second point. Different. But this is a decision for Keir Starmer. We're committed to a new model because we are absolutely clear that it should never have been abolished in the first place. It's been a disaster. It's been a disaster for our international reputation. It's been a disaster for the morale of the SCDO. It's just recovering. The government brought in Andrew Mitchell in part to try and shore things up. It's been such a catastrophic failure by Dominic Raab and Boris Johnson. I hold desperately responsible for it. So we're absolutely committed to the new model. We hear what people say around the importance of independence and cabinet representation. But I think I'm going to leave that to Keir. And I didn't write my notes properly.
There was a question about the illegal migration bill from
Oh,
and
yeah.
the
I mean, I
incorporation of
think,
treaties.
look, this is an issue, again, what I said before as Justice Minister, of course I'm committed to. I'm not, Steve Reed isn't here, but he's bound by what I said. So I'm committed to that. Perhaps I should have put that back into my speech today. So thank you for reminding me. The issues around this is always an issue for any opposition who's been in opposition for some time, and some are predicting will come to power shortly. And I recall this back in '97, when we've been out of power for 18 years. What do you repeal? What do you get on with positively? What lapses? These are judgments that have got to be made when you get to office and look at how things stand. In preparing for this speech, the kind of list of features is extraordinary. And I don't think any of us, just don't think it's something that you would have predicted. I'm just going back to David Cameron and George Osborne winning in 2015. I just don't think people would have predicted this period that we've had in the country. So, and we still got, we could have another 15 months or so of the next government. There's still time for legislation. So I don't want to tie the hands of our whips or indeed of individual ministers as they assess where we are on both making positive legislation that repeals old legislation or actively repealing or letting things lapse and pass. I can't make that judgment at this stage, but I totally understand the role that liberty plays and will play in holding us to account if and when we win the next election.
David, the other question was a very broad one, but it's very brief. I think it was, could be summarised as is Labour in principle open to giving further effect to other human rights treaties domestically, such as UNCRC?
Yes.
Short answer.
Yes.
In the second row, I think we have three questions. Very short. Yeah. If we could ask the second row questions to be very quick, is that okay? Then?
Yes.
So
and I've got to try to remember.
Second row.
I will. I'll be quick. Jaideep Gupta, I'm the Director of Research and Strategy at the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and our funding supports the Modern Slavery Policy and Evidence Center, and we're shortly due to make funding available for a Center for Law and Social Justice. So themes that resonate with your comments today, and I was pleased to hear that. From a practical point of view, David, could you comment a bit further on the role of institutions of higher education, not least in furthering the intellectual agenda that sort of underwrites the vision and objectives you charted out, but indeed to position law as part of the sort of essential skills in the future job market? Some practical steps that sort of help bring that vision that you stated into life. And I suppose, if I may, a quick, profound, slightly broader question is, the credible route back to point 7. What does it look like from your perspective?
Thanks. Krishnendra Mukherjee from Doughty Street Chambers. We're pleased and proud to have you with us, David. Thank you. Thank you for being a member. One short question. Any view as to whether British companies should be regulated in terms of their behavior abroad in breaching the laws of that country or not promoting the rule of law in those countries?
Sam Wordsworth, barrister at Essex Court Chambers. Thank you so much. It's such a breath of fresh air for public international law practitioners to hear what you've been saying and to hear your rather lovely phrase about the quiet miracle underpinning economic and political life that is international law. My question really goes to departments other than yours, for your future one, we all very much hope. The FCO has always been very strongly supported by the FCO legal advisors. And when their advice hasn't been followed, it's obviously generally had terrible impacts. So the question is whether it's on your radar that other governmental departments don't necessarily have such strong institutional support, which is really very, very needed when it comes to the international law homework that's on the desks of ministers from DEFRA and from countless other departments. Thank you.
And last but definitely not least, Jeffrey Jail, the founding director of the Bingham Centre. Jeffrey.
Thank you, Murray, and a former Harvard Law School graduate and barrister in Blackstone Chambers. Two lightningly quick comments and a lightningly quick question. My first comment is to add, I was going to use the word refreshing as well at your level to endorse unequivocally rule of law, both at the national level and the international. It's wonderful to hear, and thank you for that. Secondly, to say that the kind of advice that I give to various countries on constitutional matters, I've always found that there's huge welcome from the UK to receive that advice, despite our imperial past. Amazingly, we're seen still as a Rolls-Royce system. We have our flaws, they know it, but they also respect our system up to now. And over the last few months, I've certainly found incredulity and certainly disappointment at the kind of lapses at our end. And one wonders, as you just said, about the future of the kind of aid and advice we'll be able to give if we continue on that path. My question is simply this: the Security Council. You related the inspiring words of the preamble to the UN Declaration and so on, but it's the Security Council, strangely, that's now often a block on the implementation of particularly of international criminal law, and it's China and it's Russia. And there are moves to try and extend or change the composition of the Security Council. We don't want the UK to be taken off, but there are a number of countries elsewhere, developing countries, who would like quite to be on it, or to be on it from time to time. It seems to me that that block needs to be treated as well. And do you have any plans in that regard?
Thank you so much. I'm going to work backwards, if I may. Your work and for your support for what I've said. We do support reforms in the Security Council. We don't pretend that this is easy. It's not. But for example, India, we've supported India being admitted a very, very important country, hugely important role in this kind of period, and we'll continue to prosecute that. Thank you for the mention of the FCDO's huge legal expertise that exists. I'm not yet officially able to meet with our civil servants. Some do quietly come up to me, gather, make their views known, but that will become more of a formality. We'll take back the point you made about broader issues. And it may be that my good colleague, Emily Thornbury, our shadow Attorney General, ought to come and spend some time with you and might want to deepen some of what I've said in relation to those other departments in the hugely important legal role that they will play and ensuring that they will need after this period in office. Thank you too for the points that have been made about higher education. I was Higher Education Minister under Gordon Brown, and hugely important role, real privilege to have that role. Higher education too has been under attack. Legislation around freedom of expression, an example of that. When you talk about the job market and the important role that lawyers can play, I'm sort of thinking about the important role that the UK can play. We have given some consideration to this as a very, very important super regulatory power. We've got immense expertise in this area. And there's real opportunity to build on it, to build on our young lawyers, to build on this as a forum, and to build on that. Understanding that with things like artificial intelligence, new regulation is going to be necessary. We've got some fine minds that turned their minds to those things in the past, which I think we should build on. And it's, you know, I don't want to talk about benefits of being outside the European Union, but it's one of the things that we can perhaps point to and build on. I'm actually going to be meeting with Theresa very shortly on some of the issues around international modern slavery as well. Have I left anything out?
Just your colleague from Downing Street expression about businesses being regulated.
Ah, yes. That's a Downing Street type question. So the question is the how, and I'd want to hear more about how to make this sort of commitment. I think.
David, thank you very much. We mustn't detain you any longer. Your advisors definitely very keen for you to wrap up now. So thank you so much. I think you've seen a sample of the positive response from the legal community in the room here today, and I think it's overwhelmingly positive and a feeling of refreshing looks to the future. So thank you so much for sharing the detail. We're very grateful, and we're looking forward to continuing that conversation from this point on. Thank you very much, David.
Thank you.